Hey guys, it's Tellits and Bolts. Recently, you may have seen my Chapter 33 analysis blowing up on Twitter with Boruto fans accusing me of being brainless, biased, a terrible translator who knows nothing about context, or, my favorite, a stupidity. And so, in this video, I wanted to further explain my perspective on things and a bit of where my interpretation in the scene came from, with a little extra analysis from 6 Japanese people. First, in order to understand this scene, you have to understand something about the language being used here and how it differs from English. I originally started off my analysis of this scene by showing in reference to the manga how everyone else seems to express their worry and concern for Sarada in this chapter, and how they've expressed worry and concern for people in the past as well. I tried to explain how this specific line was different, how what Sumire does here is different. But apparently, that was controversial. My analysis is biased. So, without further ado, let's zoom in on a word with 100% native speakers who were born and raised in Japan. The line Sumire says is, Boruto-kun, Sarada no yodai wa? Now let's see what they have to say about this word yodai and the phrasing here.
なんかお医者さんが使うイメージ。あんまり親が子供に向かって「容体どう?」とは言わないよね。体調どう？硬い。私ニュースとかで誰かが意識不明の重体で容体は良くなりましたとか安定してきました。なんかね、硬いもそういうフォーマルな場面で使う。なんか友達に対して心配してる人使わないよね。絶対使わない。だよね。体調どうしか絶対言わない。でも体調どう？体調大丈夫？容体どうですかは本当にお医者さんがニュースでしか聞かないかもしれない。OK、じゃあそれだけでした。ありがとうございます。楽しみどうぞ。
Okay, there you have it. Anyway, that was for the first group that I asked. That was 5 people. For context, I met these people last week. I think I included this somewhere in here, but I met these people last week, and I happened to do group work with them, and we happened to have extra time after group work, so I asked them about their opinions on the word yodai. And that was all the context they got. This guy had a little bit more context. So now let's go into what this guy said.
どう言えばいいかな。
まあ、容体は普通にどんな状況で使いますか？
容体は、まあその友達とか関係なく、まあ普通はなんか、例えば、病院とか行った時に、こう、なんだろう、その、第三者の、状態のことを聞くときに、使う言葉だけど、でも、きついな。なんか友達を心配して聞いてるって感じっていうよりかは、なんか、なんだろう、もっと、まあ、戦いのシーンっていうのもあって、とりあえずその人が戦えるかとか、まあ、急な時に聞いた状態だから容体になってて、本当はもしちゃんと友達とか、まあ、もう思ってる人だったら、容体じゃなくて例えば大丈夫みたいな感じの言葉を使うのかなみたいな。
そうなんですよね。そのこれを見てなんか大丈夫って聞いてるより容体はって聞いたって
距離があるよね。
距離ってちょっと感じられます。
Okay. None of these people have read Boruto, so obviously they can't do an in-depth character analysis or anything. But in both the first time I asked just about the word yodai and where I described the scene and showed the panel, not only did they say it's not a word you would use out of concern for your friend, they also said it's cold, stiff, and implies the feeling of emotional distance. Now you can see why this threw up a flag for me as a translator as a word that was going to get misinterpreted with a simple translation, as well as why I pulled it out specifically to analyze it, since it was bound to miss out on nuance in the Western fandom where emotional distance isn't as conveyed with formal or stiff or cold speech. So, for those of you that don't know, on my blog, I usually highlight these phrases that can't be 100% translated cleanly with a simple word, and I elaborate on them. That is the point of this blog. That is why I pointed out this line. It has nothing to do with disproving Borosumi. It has nothing to do with shipping Borosara. It has everything to do with the fact that this line could not be translated in a way that put all of the nuance of the word into the translation, if that makes sense. That's why I highlighted it. That's the only reason. Moving on. I'm not saying that Sumire can't be concerned for Sarada at all just because she uses this phrase. That would be a biased interpretation, despite what you just heard from the people I asked, because I know who Sumire is as a character. And it doesn't come from it that she's worried about Sarada. It doesn't come from the words, the specific words that she used at all. So that's just me understanding who Sumire is and that she wouldn't be cold-heartedly just asking about Sarada's physical condition without any sort of concern at all whatsoever. Even though that word does not directly imply concern, I feel like Sumire is a person who would be concerned about Sarada in this situation, which is why I can say that it's not completely neglecting concern, even though that phrase doesn't express concern for a friend, which I also put in my original analysis. But I'm just saying, this particular phrase does not possess the sentiment of concern for a friend through the way it is being asked. Again, this is specifically a stiff phrase that you use for a report on someone's physical condition. As I stated in my analysis, it's like a commander asking a soldier, and now we have a doctor asking a patient, or a news report. And in terms of a doctor asking a patient, it's not really a doctor asking a patient so much as it is, like the other guy said, a doctor asking a third party about how a patient's physical condition is, like asking for a status update or a report. It's not like, oh, how have you been feeling lately? Because they would use a completely different word for that. And I should know because I'm always in the hospital. It's usually taichou wa dou or karada no yosu wa dou. Now that we have that clear. It's not something that you use toward a friend, and it's not something a parent would say to their child because it's too stiff and formal of a phrase. And those were things that the Japanese people who I asked said. Because again, I do live in Japan and I do speak Japanese. Wow, controversial. Alright. There are several things you could say now that you understand the nuances of this phrase. But in understanding the culture, the manga, and the background, my analysis of the potential reasons was that she seems to be asking it in this way to ground Boruto. Boruto seems very worried about Sarada on a level that shows he isn't thinking clearly. He yelled her name, flew up to catch her, immediately said she was unconscious, and then said her name again as if trying to wake her up. The original was Oi Sarada, and the official translated it to, hey, wake up. But he doesn't take his eyes off her. When they land on the ground, she's still in his arms, and he almost doesn't even seem to care about the fact that Mamushi is there and multiplying, since he isn't looking Mamushi's way at all. You can, again, that's just me looking at the manga itself. I'm not making up any sort of biased interpretation. That is what is in the manga. Okay, that is the context of Boruto in the previous chapter. The context of this situation is their plan just failed. Mamushi is multiplying rapidly to numbers they won't be able to do anything about. The only person who could finish them all off at once, so that they can't multiply anymore, along with one of their stronger fighters, Kawaki, are now both out of commission. That context is set up by the intro, words of the chapter itself, and both the side margins and on the cover page. So now you have the context surrounding the situation. You get into the chapter, and the first thing you see is the Mamushi clones facing away from Boruto, Sarada, and Konohamaru. They're focused on Ada, who is at the top left of the page, while Boruto and Kuro are at the bottom left, and Kawaki is on the bottom right, direct opposite Ada. Himawari is slightly above that, running towards Kawaki. So now you have all the characters' positions to get this idea of what's going on in the scene. Then we get a zoom-in panel of Boruto looking towards the Mamushi clones, and then a zoom-in on a panel of Sarada's face from what appears to be Boruto's perspective. I'm not going to say it is Boruto's perspective, but it does appear to be that way. Kawaki, whose vision Sumire can see, is looking at the Mamushi clones, and then at Himawari, and tells her to worry about Sarada instead. Directly after this is when Sumire asks Boruto the question, what is Sarada's physical condition or yodai? She asks for a report. Once again, she is stiffly asking for a status update from an emotionally removed perspective. Then Boruto tilts Sarada's face and reports that she's alive and breathing. No one is being attacked yet, but the Mamushi clones are indeed closing in on Ada. That is the setup to the line. Sumire clearly hears through Inujin's mind link and sees that Boruto's focus is anywhere but the battlefield. So instead of expressing direct concern for Sarada like everyone else in the situation is, she said Boruto's name in bold font instead and asked a very stiff phrase specifically about Sarada's physical condition in a way that prompts him to report back to her about the details of her injury and focus on the fact that she is indeed alive. Notice how when Konohamaru asks if she's okay, Boruto responds with wakanne, which is the harsh form of I don't know, which in my translation became I don't know, darn it, with a different word, because that small e, which is usually used for emphasis since it's katakana, which is another topic which I'm not going to get into this video, but either way, he's clearly disoriented and distressed, and you've seen me translate these small katakana for many other people's speeches using curse words, and I've already explained why it warrants a curse word and why curse words are not a thing in Japanese. Usually they don't use specific words, but it's more about the tone. I went into all that in other videos, so I'm not going to explain it here again. But from the second Sumire asks about Sarada's physical condition, the first thing Boruto does is more closely inspect the injury instead of just holding her. He puts his hand on her face, tilts her head, and says that she is alive, and then he goes on to talk about the damage to her eye specifically, and finally Himawari heals her, and he puts her down and focuses back on the battle. That's where that analysis point came from. Not only is the question stiff and formal, the way Boruto responds to it clearly takes him out of the headspace he was just in and puts him into a more ninja reporting on the battlefield type of headspace. So now we're going to get to the more controversial point. Because of the emotional distance of this word and the stiff way in which it's asked and the understanding of the interpersonal relationships these characters have, this phrase comes off with a tinge of jealousy. Controversial, I know, but when I explain the rest of the context to the second guy who appears in my Ask Friends section, or not necessarily friends, but just people I happen to encounter on that specific day, because this guy I literally just met today, and I showed him some panels, specifically the context of the hug, where Boruto hugs Sarada back and Sumire is forced to watch, chapter 16 and 17, where Sumire confronts Sarada about the hug and asks why she didn't think of her feelings in that moment, as well as the side-eye reveal, which only happens in chapter 17. Naruto Next Generation chapter 19 with the whole "does that bother you, Sarada, that other girls like Boruto?" and "well, it certainly bothers me" lines that also appear in her character intro page and introduction corner, which to my grave misfortune I did not record. And I also forgot to finish my sentence, so I'm just gonna explain here that he did eventually agree with me, and he was like, oh, that could be the case, like if all this stuff was, with all this added context, that makes sense for there to be some jealousy there, which I'll get into after this brief side rant about my professor. My apologies. My professor, who knows me very well, I was talking to him after class about this whole situation and how people blew up on the internet over this, because he enjoys this kind of discourse of when there's a cultural disconnect that's so severe that people argue over it, to kind of, not to an extreme, but to the point where it's where someone says an analysis breakdown becomes completely controversial. So I was like, oh, it just happened again with this thing, because he's been my professor for several years and knows about the initial blowing up of Sumire fans over Otome Gokoro and that whole controversy, as well as the Omoi controversy. There's been several that I've tried to explain, and the Sumire fans were like, how dare you? And then, eventually stuff happens and they end up taking it back. But so he's been following along with all this as my professor. And at the end of class, he was making a point that related to all of that. And so he used me as an example and said, sometimes the disconnect is so severe that it causes online arguments. Then somebody came up to me after class and started asking, which gave me the opportunity to then talk with them in a little bit more depth about the situation as well, which is what the second guy was, which was why he was going slower and trying to understand the full context. But he hadn't read Boruto, so obviously he couldn't give his full context on the whole, whether or not there was jealousy involved, or whether or not she wasn't concerned, which we did get into after I stopped the recording, and then we started talking further in depth about the context, and then he was like, oh yeah, I could see that. As for Sumire as a character, the reason I felt those particular scenes were important is because Sumire has made her feelings for Boruto clear from the start. She clearly likes him. She also sees Sarada as competition because she keeps bringing her feelings up to Sarada and asking how Sarada feels about Boruto, as well as the events from chapter 16 and 25. Number 1, saying how she isn't going to hold back anymore. Number 2, directly seeing how Boruto interacted with Sarada during that hug, and the way she ended up responding to it in turn. They are still friends. Sumire and Sarada are still friends. Let me clarify this. You can be love rivals and friends with someone in Japan. That's okay. I know that's not as common in the West, but it's pretty common in shoujo manga for the characters that are kind of, competing over this guy, competing for this guy's attention, or competing for this, like, both wanting to confess to this guy. It's okay for them to be friends as long as they clarify, that the guy is the one who decides in the end. And that's what they have been going through. That's what they decided. That's what their whole conversation was about. They are friends. That's fine. That's good. That's great writing. I'm so glad that Ikemoto made the decision to do that, because in shoujo manga things can get really toxic and annoying, and it sucks, and I don't like reading that type of manga, but this is different. Like, Ikemoto did such a good job having them talk through all of this and giving them the time to, like, come to terms with these feelings, right? Okay. Covered, right? Now, when you take the context of this into account, in this scene, Boruto not only yelled Sarada's name, he caught her midair, put her in the crook of his arm as opposed to holding her at arm's length, which is another thing I talked about last chapter, didn't take his eyes off her, his distress comes through in his speech, he didn't look at Mamashi until the opening of this chapter and seemed to look right back towards Sarada, and his expression seems more intense in comparison to what he's shown in battle previously or in TBV in general. Sumire isn't dumb. She saw Boruto hug Sarada back and also saw his facial expression in that moment. The one that made that hug intimate wasn't Sarada, it was Boruto. I have to go into a whole hug rant in Japanese culture to explain that, but putting that matter aside for the time being, sorry for everyone who's patiently waiting that analysis and have asked me for it multiple times. Either way, both the Japanese and American fandoms were in a buzz about how intimately Boruto was treating Sarada in the scene, whether it's wiping the blood from her face, or the way he holds her, whatever it is, the way that he doesn't take his eyes off her. There's all these things that they've been talking about, right? And, like, obviously, this scene was a moment in which Boruto treats Sarada in a way that does not come across as a simple teammate. So it would be completely normal for Sumire to get jealous of all the attention, and especially the kind of attention Boruto is giving Sarada because she likes him. And when you have that context, it's put on display by the kind of language she chooses to use. This cold and distant way she asked specifically for Sarada's physical condition instead of using another word like taicho, which still carries a lot of the same meanings and would have likely produced the same result from Boruto in terms of grounding him into analysis, but it's softer and something that you could use in both either a doctor context or a friend context, and not a news anchor level of emotional removal. And then there's the facial expression that she makes afterward that an ex-user also kindly emphasized to me at least 3 times when arguing. But either way, when you compare that to her expression in chapter 5 when Boruto hugs Sarada, they do bear slight resemblance. That isn't a full basis for my argument, because I don't think that should be used, because it's not. It's like a small additional side point that you may or may not take into consideration. But it's more about the type of way Sumire asks him, specifically calling him out by name, especially since this happens before any of the fighting resumes. So it's not like he's completely ignoring the battle and she's saying it out of urgency. It's more preemptive. I'm also not saying that Sumire is 100% jealous in this scene. I'm saying her phrasing could have the undertone of jealousy to it because of how it's phrased. Because part of Sumire's character is loving Boruto and feeling sad when he shows Sarada a clearly heightened level of physical and emotional attention, and this is a clearly heightened level of physical and emotional attention. This interpretation, while it is an opinion, very much fits with the surrounding context of not only the word she uses, but the kind of character she has been shown to be up until now. And I'm also not saying because she's jealous she's not worried about Sarada. That's not it at all. Like I mentioned before, while this is a cold and emotionally distant phrase, it's not something you would try to say to express worry for a friend, and Sumire's goal does seem to be to snap Boruto out of it. It doesn't take away from the fact that under the surface, Sumire is likely worried for Sarada. Sumire is not a cold-hearted jerk. That is not in her character. That's why you can say, despite her saying this cold-hearted phrase, she is still worried for Sarada. Likely. It's likely that she's worried for Sarada. I mean, why wouldn't she be? Just like you can also say, despite seeing Boruto act this way could very well hurt her emotionally and cause her to use a colder phrase to pull his attention away from her and back to battle. So, I put both in there, again, because I know the kind of character that Sumire is, and I'm not just taking it from the context of this one phrase that she says, but the context of her character as a whole. Which would bring us to my conversation about old shoujo tropes and the kind of character role Sumire fills and the kind of style Ikemoto is imitating and how those feelings play into being relatable from a Japanese cultural perspective and why the scene might have been included this way, and there are certain rules and regulations regarding interpersonal relationships that the West doesn't have that also play into this, but that's going to take a much longer time to write, so I'm not going to put all that into this video, and it will be a separate video that you will again have to look forward to another time. Yay! Hopefully this clears up some of my thoughts, and I know I'm going to get slammed again for this, but I decided not to care. Enjoy!